Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 96, Part 1, Clancy of the Overflow. I would like to thank Ian Lee from the Deniliquin Historical Society for giving me a newspaper article outlining one of the links to Clancy of the Overflow in Deniliquin. I'm also a teacher, and I had a senior class do an assignment where they looked into their family history and their culture, and one of my students has the McNamaras as her direct ancestors. That gave me the impetus to start researching into Clancy of the Overflow and the subject of the poem. The poem Clancy of the Overflow, written by Banjo Paterson, is written from the point of view of a city dweller who once met the title character, a shearer and a drover, and now envies the imagined pleasures of Clancy's lifestyle, which he compares favourably to life in the dusty, dirty city. The poem is possibly based on Paterson's own experience, and there are several theories as to who was the inspiration of the poem. In the Sunday Herald in Sydney on the 4th of December 1949, it says Clancy of the Overflow is an old friend of Banjo Paterson fans and is becoming part of Australian folklore. But who was Clancy and where was the Overflow? Mr. Chisholm summed up the information given to him during the week. Most said that Clancy of the Overflow was Thomas Gerald Clancy, a drover out in the Central West in the 1890s. Another big section of opinion held that Clancy was Thomas Michael McNamara, who was born at Tumut but best known in the Wagga district. He was also droving all over the middle of the state. He had a brother-in-law, Jim Troy, who the McNamara protagonists claim was the original of Paterson's Man from Snowy River. A third substantial section of opinion held that Clancy was a myth. The only three places mentioned in terms of the Overflow was the Overflow station near Nymagee, the Overflow station near Warren, and the Overflow station somewhere in the Barcoo country of central Queensland. Mr. Chisholm's opinion is that Clancy was no particular person and that the Overflow was no particular place. He said Paterson probably knew both the Clancys and the McNamaras, but I think he took the name Clancy because it was a simple name and easy to rhyme. Paterson probably seized on the name Overflow as a good generic typical name for inland Australia. Clancy is probably Paterson's idealised version of the bushman, an idea to which both the Clancys and the McNamaras contributed. Writers use their imagination, they meet real people, and they grab a couple of those real people and mush them together to create a character. So one theory is Clancy is a character that comes out of imagination, but based on people he's probably met. Banjo Paterson himself maintained to the end of his life that there was no actual single horseman in his mind when he wrote the ballad. And it is such a beautiful ballad, and I'm sure that all of us know quite a bit of it off the cuff, but I am adding on my Facebook page a rendition read by Jack Thompson. So the aim of this episode is to delve into the two men, Thomas Gerald Clancy and Thomas Michael McNamara, and to give you a little bit of a picture of the men themselves, their family members, and also their link to Banjo Paterson. So Thomas Gerald Clancy was born in Castletown Rock in County Cork, Ireland, on the 26th of December 1834. His parents were Thomas Clancy and Anne Kirby. Thomas and Anne married at St Colman's Cathedral in County Cork, Ireland, on the 2nd of February 1830. Anne's father, Thomas Kirby, was an architect and apparently in a reasonable financial position, for he is reputed to have given his daughter £1,000 as a wedding gift. In the early 1840s, enticed by stories of fabulous gold finds in the colonies, and with the prospect of a bleak future in Ireland, Thomas and Anne Clancy decided to leave their home in Castletown Rock, County of Cork, to make their fortune in Australia. The Bendigo Gold Rush had started, and people from many countries flocked to the port of Melbourne. Thomas and Anne brought the older members of their family and the baby, leaving two little girls with their grandmothers, intending to send for them when they settled in their new land. The introduction of the bounty system enabled many people from Ireland, as well as from England and Scotland, to migrate. During the 1830s and 40s, almost half of all assisted migrants were of Irish origin. So Thomas Clancy his wife and 4 children, John, Eleanor, Thomas and Agnes, embarked on the Diamond, leaving Catherine, 5 years old, and Mary Hannah, 3 years old, with their grandmothers. A hint as why they were left may be obtained from the work of Caroline Chisholm. In the late 1840s, she discovered that hundreds of Irish children had been left behind by their parents who had emigrated. It stated that the bounty was only paid for 4 children. This may have explained why 2 of the girls were left behind. The family arrived on the 4th of November 1841. Anne gave birth to 2 more children after their arrival in Melbourne. Dr. Irons was selected as one of the men to act as teachers to the children on the voyage out, and it's quite possible that Thomas Clancy was enlisted to assist, as Thomas taught when he first arrived in Melbourne. After some schooling in Ireland, the girls that were left behind attended school in France. But while there, the younger sister Mary contracted measles and almost lost her sight. Doctors said a long sea voyage might cure her, so the grandparents decided to send them to their parents, and they embarked on a sailing ship bound for Australia. Also with Caroline Chisholm's work in recognising that there were children left behind due to the limit of the 4 children ticket, in May there was a notice that was issued that families could apply for the free passage of those children left behind, which I'm sure the grandparents would have taken advantage of. Unfortunately, the grandparents' letter notifying Thomas of their arrival did not reach him, and there was no one to meet them when they arrived in Melbourne. The weather was cold and bleak, similar to the climate that they left in Ireland, and the absence of their parents must have been a traumatic experience for the youngsters, who'd led rather sheltered lives. The sea voyage, too, had been long and tedious, and although they had been in the care of the captain, bad food and seasickness had taken their toll. So the boat arrived on Christmas Day in 1852. Melbourne was vastly different to Castletown Rock. It was a rough, undisciplined town and not safe to leave little girls unprotected. Everything and everyone around them in Melbourne was strange. Melbourne had grown rapidly, and with the discovery of gold, the population quickly increased. Ships from many places were filling the harbour and discharging human cargo into a town already overcrowded. The captain, a kindly man, decided to keep them on board until he was ready to start on the return journey. He then left them with a reputable woman who kept a boarding house, and she agreed to keep them until Thomas could be found, on condition that they helped with the work for their board and lodging. They hadn't been there long when a man who came for a meal asked who they were. When told, he said that Mary very much looked like her mother, and he'd seen their parents not long ago near Bendigo and was able to tell them how to get a message to Thomas. It was the custom for the postmaster in Melbourne to publish lists of letters lying at the post office, and once in a while the name Thomas Clancy appears. His name appears in the Argus on the 10th of November 1848, which could have been when they moved to Deben Creek. Again, there were unclaimed letters for Thomas Clancy published on the 9th of June and the 25th of August 1852. One or both of these letters might have been from Ireland, giving details about the imminent arrival of the girls. It's probable that the letters arrived about the time that Thomas moved from Allenvale to Sheepwash Creek, so in the latter part of 1852, and that's why he didn't receive the letters. Meanwhile, their parents were over 100 miles away, oblivious to the presence of their children in this strange new world. So in due time, the Clancys did receive word that their daughters were in Melbourne. Anne Clancy and her sons John and Thomas went in 2 bullock drays to pick the girls up and get a load of supplies. It was now autumn, and according to family tradition, the return journey took 3 months as the winter had set in, and the loaded drays were often bogged in the muddy roads. The descendants have the story that the Clancys slept under the stars, which the girls said they enjoyed despite the weather. For them it was a new experience, but there would be occasions when the more experienced members suggested a more prudent arrangement for sleeping, such as sharing the safety of an inn. As they travelled, there would be much to talk about, the girls telling of their years in Ireland and their mother and brothers telling them a great deal about what is new about Victoria. When they arrived at Sheepwash Creek, all the family were together again, except for one married member, Eleanor, who was living at Glenorchy. Like many others, the Clancys had learned to be resourceful and independent to a large extent. Anne made clothes for the family. She also made bread and soap and candles from tallow, and she even made many of the medicines. On the 16th of February 1853, Thomas Clancy puts an ad in the paper for a £30 reward. Caution to pound keepers and auctioneers. Stolen from the junction of the Sheepwash and Emu Creeks on Mr Ross's station, a black horse, newly branded C on both shoulders with other brands, a small star on the forehead. £50 will be paid on the conviction of the thief, or £3 on delivery of the horse to the undersigned at the above place. An advertisement appeared in the Government Gazette on the 12th of May 1854. Thomas acquired further land. In total, he obtained 245 acres. Thomas Clancy's larger holding was traversed by Emu Creek just before it joins Axe Creek. Here he proceeded to build a cottage of a slab building with a low veranda running the length of the front of it. Just across the creek he planted an orchard. With the rapidly rising population in Bendigo, a lot of the outlying towns had people planting fresh produce to be able to sell. Another who settled in the Strathfield-Say area and established himself as a grocer was Roger D'Aulnay, who with his wife Hannah and children came from Queenstown, County Cork in 1853. A close relationship developed between the Clancys and the D'Aulnays, possibly because of their common links with Cove. The result of this association was that a son and a daughter in one family married a daughter and son in the other. Dr. Backhouse established a school there in 1856. Irish Town was when Dr. Backhouse built his tent chapel and later his first St Killian's Church. Bishop Gould paid his first visit to Bendigo on the 10th of December 1855 and took up residence in the clergyman's tent. The bishop noted that the place was where Mass was celebrated in Bendigo, but at present was a miserable slab affair, badly covered with canvas. It does not accommodate many and it has 2 good bells. On the 16th of February 1853, Thomas Clancy puts an ad in the paper for a £30 reward. Caution to pound keepers and auctioneers. Stolen from the junction of the Sheepwash and Emu Creeks on Mr Ross's station, a black horse, newly branded C on both shoulders with other brands, a small star on the forehead. £50 will be paid on the conviction of the thief, or £3 on delivery of the horse to the undersigned at the above place. Thomas Clancy Sr. decided to give up farming at Strathfield-Say, and on the 19th of February 1859, in the Bendigo Advertiser, for sale, the well-known productive farm on Emu Creek, the property of Mr Thomas Clancy, containing 68 acres, the greater extent in a high state of cultivation, well cleared, fenced and divided into 5 paddocks and a garden. The Emu Creek runs through the centre, ensuring a constant supply of pure water. There is a dwelling house of 6 rooms, men's huts, stables, sheds, extensive stockyards and other offices, bounded on 2 sides by a large reserve. The place was selected and occupied by the present owner previous to any land sale in the district and is without exception the best situated farm in the vicinity of Sandhurst. Before he sold the Strathfield-Say property, Thomas acquired an allotment in Bendigo to which he took those members of his family who still lived with him. And it mentions on the 10th of August 1859, just out of Bendigo, the Town Hall Hotel. It will be seen by advertisement that a hotel under the above title has been opened in Market Square under the management of Mr Thomas Clancy. The daughters assisted in running the hotel, and 9 days after this announcement, the Town Hall Hotel opposite the Weybridge at Market Square. Thomas Clancy, late of Emu Creek, begs to intimate to his friends and the public that he's opened the above hotel, where he hopes to obtain a share of their patronage, which he is determined to deserve by keeping every article of the best quality. Persons having business at the market or town hall can be accommodated with comfortable rooms. Extensive stabling and good bullock yards are attached to the premises. However, by the 2nd of November 1859, Thomas Clancy is listed as insolvent. His debts were £923 and his assets £333, with a deficiency of £590. And he lists the cause of insolvency as losses in trade, protracted illness and fear of arrest. And he conveyed this property to his son on the 30th of December 1859. And Thomas died only a month later, on the 12th of December, at the comparatively early age of 51 years, and their youngest child was only 7 years old at the time. And he was buried in a grave now unmarked in the Junction Cemetery. and Dr. Backhouse, who'd been so closely associated with the family, performed the last rites. Anne and Thomas had been married nearly 30 years. They adapted well to the pioneering conditions of Victoria and made progress. They gave all 8 children a fair education, and beginning as a farmer in Ireland, he had many and varied occupations in his adopted land: a farm employee, a superintendent of an immigrant's home, teacher, policeman, employee on a station, farmer, and finally a licensed victualler. He and his wife brought up the whole family devoted to the church. He was proud of his Irish ancestry and proud of the place that he once held amongst Irish gentry. On occasion, he contrasted his present situation in Victoria with the life he knew in Ireland, riding around the Clancy property on his horse Copes. A touch of pride was revealed by the descendants in one incident. He was making a trip from Bendigo to Melbourne, and he'd been told by his wife to buy an overcoat. He brought back 6, and she asked why, and he replied, "A gentleman does not deal in ones." He was a big man and bearded, and apart from the photograph of the group of the Clancys at Strathfield Say, there is no known photograph of him. So after Thomas's death, his wife Anne moved with 5 of her 8 children to Deniliquin in southern New South Wales in the early 1860s. John, Eleanor and Mary were married with their own families and stayed in Bendigo. Many family members worked at the Mathara station. In 2015, there was an headline article in the Deniliquin Pastoral Times where it outlined that there was a gravesite discovery that revealed Deniliquin's connection to Banjo's famous drover. And it goes on to say that it was discovered that the famous drover's mother, Anne Clancy, is buried at Deniliquin Cemetery. Geraldine Collis, who was then the wife of the Nationals deputy, was travelling around New South Wales, and she was out there at the time looking at her ancestor's gravestone and mentioned how she was a descendant of the Clancy family who had migrated from Ireland to Melbourne in the 1840s. And it says it seems that this is a little known fact. No one spoken to locally was aware that she was buried here. It's a huge discovery of Deniliquin to think that an iconic figure's mother lived in Deniliquin and that her famous son spent time here as well. Banjo Paterson used to visit Deniliquin in the years after he penned Clancy of the Overflow. So it says that the family lived in the area for the next 2 decades, even when Anne died in 1864. She died on April 22nd, 1864 at the age of 56 due to dropsy. So Anne is buried with her daughters Agnes and Catherine married William D'Aunay, and they are all buried in the same fenced-off plot. So now I'm going to cover the children. So firstly, and most particularly Thomas Gerald Clancy, so the link between Banjo Paterson and the poem. As mentioned, the Clancy children worked on and about Mathara Station, and this is where Thomas worked at the time of his marriage. Thomas married Catherine Caroline Mangan, known as Kate, at St Michael's Catholic Church, Deniliquin, on the 18th of September 1862, when he was 27 and Kate only 16. Kate was the daughter of Anthony Mangan and Bridget O'Brien. Bridget died when Kate was 14, and Anthony deserted his daughter 12 months later, marrying for a second time in Geelong, and then he immigrated to New Zealand in 1863. He took his 2 sons, Thomas and Francis, with him, but not Bridget. Interestingly, Anthony Mangan actually came out on the same ship as the Clancy family to Australia. So on the 11th of April 1861 in the Police Gazette, Anthony Mangan, described in the above reference, is again charged with deserting his child. He's 35 years of age, 5'7", black hair, dark eyes, very small dark whiskers turning grey, medium build, a mark of an old cut on the upper lip, an Irishman, shoemaker, now supposed to be in Melbourne. On the 19th of December 1863, it mentions that Thomas Clancy is a carrier. And then on the 13th of February 1869, Thomas Gerald Clancy is listed as getting a hawker's licence. So Thomas and Kate had 5 children. The first, Mary Angela, was born in Deniliquin on the 25th of July 1863. She married John Francis Kelly in Victoria in 1884. They had 2 children, and Mary died on the 29th of April 1891 in South Fitzroy at the residence of her brother-in-law, aged only 27. Her husband had died in June 1889, and he was the publican of the All Nations Hotel in Separation Street, Richmond. They left 2 children orphaned once Mary had died. Annie Caroline was born in Deniliquin on the 23rd of November 1864. She married Frederick George Brooks in Victoria in 1883. They had 6 children, 3 surviving infancy, and Annie died in Kew, Victoria on the 6th of April 1943, aged 78. Francis Patrick was born on the 3rd of January 1867 at Mathara. He married Annie Frances Lithen in Victoria in 1899, and they had 3 daughters. Francis was a painter, and he died in Preston, Victoria in March 1940, aged 73. And Gerald Thomas was born on the 2nd of February 1868 in Deniliquin, and he died at the age of 7 in Echuca. And it says, the son of Mrs. Clancy, dressmaker in Haygarth Street. The following are the particulars of the death of the poor little fellow. It appears that Mrs. Clancy has a house situated on the riverbank in the locality of Mackintosh's Mills. And yesterday afternoon at about 3 o'clock, her eldest girl, about 12 years of age, and the boy, who's about 6 years old, were bathing in the river. Both the girl and the boy, it seems, were able to swim, and the girl had taken her younger sister, a mere infant in her arms, into the water also. Attention was first directed to the children by some persons on the bank hearing the girl screaming, and going to the part of the river where the children were, only the girl and the child were seen on the surface, and the girl appeared to be helpless and sinking. Captain Toomer of the steamer Wiradjuri, which was moored on the opposite side, heard the screaming and, seeing the dangerous position of the girl, immediately jumped into the river and swam to the spot and was just in time to save the girl and the infant, whom the girl was still holding in her arms as she struggled in the water. Having brought the 2 children to land, Captain Toomer dived 4 or 5 times in the endeavour to find the boy, but without succeeding, and at last to give up his courageous efforts in despair. The police and others were engaged to a late hour last evening dragging the river for the body of the boy, but did not find it. Of course, one cannot naturally wonder that children of such tender years were allowed to bathe in the river, but as we've stated, both the girl and boy had learnt to swim and were into the habit of going into the river. The fatal accident, it is stated, was caused by the children having got into one of the many strong eddies. The 5th child, Ada Mabel Clancy, was born on the 18th of September 1871 in Echuca, and she died at the age of 5 on the 20th of January 1877 in Echuca. And a death notice was placed in the paper saying that she was the youngest daughter of Thomas Gerald Clancy of Haygarth Street, Echuca, 5 years old and 8 months. So by the 24th of April 1872, Thomas Gerald Clancy is in Echuca and he's working as a herdsman, but he actually goes into insolvency. And it says his cause of insolvency was a loss incurred in building a barge for the Murray River and sickness in his family. His liabilities were £131, his assets only £22, and a deficiency of £109. 6 years later, on the 8th of July 1878, there was an article stating there was a fire in Haygarth Street. Shortly before 7 o'clock last evening, the fire bell tolled out its alarm, and it was found that a wooden tenement in Haygarth Street, occupied by Mrs. Clancy as a dressmaker's and fancy goods establishment and servants' registry office, was in a mass of flames. The house, being entirely composed of wood, was consumed with marvellous rapidity, and in about 20 minutes there was only charred timber that remained. Nothing whatsoever was saved, and all that could be done was to get 2 little children who were in bed safely away. The fire brigade turned out promptly, but their efforts were neutralised by an insufficient supply of hose. Amongst the articles destroyed were a large quantity of ladies' wearing apparel and a valuable piano. A month later, it says, we are glad to see that notwithstanding the dull times, one of the shops recently erected is a shop for Mrs. Clancy, a fancy goods shop and draper. Around the time of the late 1870s, it seems that Thomas Clancy wasn't at home. He actually started working as a drover through Eastern Australia, no doubt after he had been insolvent. So he was moving mobs of cattle and sheep, anywhere between 5,000 and 15,000 at a time. And in September 1882, it places him with a mob of sheep on the Lachlan River, right where the narrator of the Clancy of the Overflow said that he knew Clancy years ago. Paterson was quoted as saying that he was working as a lawyer when someone asked him to send a letter to a man named Thomas Gerald Clancy asking for a payment that had not been received. Paterson sent the letter to the Overflow, the sheep station 100 kilometres southwest of Nyngan in New South Wales, and received a reply that read, "Clancy's gone to Queensland droving and we don't know where he are." The letter looked as though it had been written with a thumbnail dipped in tar, and it is from this that Banjo Paterson found inspiration for the poem. Thomas knew Banjo Paterson because Banjo Paterson drew up and witnessed the will of Thomas Gerald Clancy. Clancy makes a cameo appearance in another popular Banjo Paterson poem, The Man from Snowy River, which was first published the following year. Tom Clancy was listed as arriving at Cunnamulla from Wilcannia with sheep, and him going through Yulo, and that was on the 15th of January 1887. In later life, Thomas Clancy retired to Melbourne with his wife Kate, and in 1910 he told a reporter of the Melbourne Advocate that he was indeed the party of whom the poem was based. They owned Clancy's Union Club Hotel in Fitzroy, and Catherine was a licensee in 1877 and 1878, and then after her death in 1888, her son-in-law Fred Brooks held the licence. Thomas then went on to marry Emily Ellen Ann Peake, known as Nellie, at the Cannia Goldfields in Queensland on the 9th of November 1889. They had 4 children together: Leonise Geraldine Clancy, who was born on the 8th of May 1885 at Petersham, New South Wales, 4.5 years before her parents married, and 3 years before Kate, Thomas's wife, died. Thomas listed himself as a carpenter, and Emily listed herself as Anne Clancy, despite not yet being married. Leonise married Nicholas Curran on the 29th of March 1921 at St Joseph's in Malvern, Victoria. They had 1 daughter, and Leonise died in October 1970 in Donvale, Victoria, aged 85. Their second child, Leon George Clancy, was born on the 4th of August 1888 in Eidsvold, Queensland. And on the 23rd of March 1906, there is a Police Gazette notice in regards to Leon. It says that he was tried at Traralgon on the 20th of March 1906 for unlawfully using a horse and larceny. He was a native of Queensland, a labourer, born in 1888, 5 foot 5 1/4 inches tall, fresh complexion, brown hair and grey eyes, high forehead, short nose, small ears, a heart pierced with 2 arrows on the left arm, top joint of index finger, right hand missing, ring on 4th finger, right hand, transferred to the Excelsior Home for Boys. And the Traralgon record on the 23rd of March 1906 states that Leon Clancy was charged by Constable Johnson on the 12th of November for stealing and taking away a dark bay mare, the property of Mrs. C. Fuge of Tyres, valued at £15. Senior Constable Noble, who conducted the prosecution, stated that the charge would be withdrawn and one of illegally using gone on with. Under it, the accused was liable for a fine of £20 or 1 year's imprisonment. He then briefly stated the case and said the accused was very young, but the offence was a serious one and had caused considerable trouble and expense. Mrs. C. Fuge, storekeeper residing at Tyres, deposed that she had seen the accused about Tyres. On the 12th of November, she put a dark bay mare in the garden, which was securely fenced. The next morning, the panel was down and the mare gone. She reported the matter to the police and also put an advertisement in the Age when she got word that the mare was at Wandong. Her son went for the animal and it cost £3 to get it back. They had never authorised the accused to take the animal away. Constable Johnson, stationed at Sale, deposed that he knew the accused, and on the 2nd he saw him near Taylor's place and asked him what his name was, and he replied Clancy. He asked the accused what he'd done with the mare, and he replied he'd sold it for £16. The constable read a statement which Clancy had made after he was arrested. In this he stated that he made his mind up to get away from Tyres, so took a bridle and stole the horse from the garden. He rode the animal to Moe and then sent his swag from there to Melbourne. He went to Seymour and then Kilmore, where the horse knocked up. He put it in a paddock and it got away. It was not true that he sold the animal for £16. Senior Constable Noble stated that the accused's parents reside in North Carlton and his mother had written asking to know where her son would be tried. He had written giving full particulars but had received no reply. He knew nothing about the accused further than that his mother had written giving him good advice. The bench, after telling the accused that the offence was a serious one and urging him to take the advice of his mother as he had all his life before him, pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment for the mare and 7 days for stealing the saddle. Leon possibly had 5 children with Ruby Maud Howick. Mary Grace, born in 1912 in Hamilton, Victoria, that died at the age of 4 months. Her mother was listed as Ruby Maud Clancy and no father listed. Donald, born in 1915 in Ballarat East, who died at the age of only 5 in February 1920, with his mother listed as Howick on both records and no father listed, even though his mother on his grave is listed as Ruby Maud Clancy. Then Nancy, born in 1917 in Ballarat, she married Royal Charles Porter, known as Roy, in Victoria in 1938. He was a farmer and they lived at Wallasdale. They had 3 children and Nancy died in Portland, Victoria in December 1990, aged 73. Shirley Allen Howick died at the age of 6 months in 1920. No father was listed. And Norman George, who was born in 1931, who died at Mortlake, Victoria in August 2006 when he was 74. He did not marry, and his gravestone states he is the son of Leon and Ruby. Leon enlisted in World War I, having his mother, Ellen Clancy, listed as his next of kin. She was living at North Carlton when he enlisted on the 12th of September 1915 at Black Boy Hill, Western Australia. Leon served in Egypt and the Middle East and returned on the 28th of August 1919. In 1915, Ruby's listed as living as Coleraine, and in 1916, Ballarat East. From 1918 to 1931, she's living with her father at Wooloora. And when her father died in 1929, he referred to Ruby by her maiden name. Leon took up a soldier settlement section of land at Minerva, Victoria at the end of 1919. By 1922, Leon was living with his mother in Paran and he listed himself as a farmhand. In 1924, Leon's recorded living at Westmere, Victoria, which is very close to Wooloora. And by 1931, Leon's working as a labourer at Wooloora. And in 1943, he's working at a station hand at Maroona, which is near to Wooloora. Ruby died in Hamilton, Victoria in June 1940, and Leon died in Warrnambool in June 1954, aged 65. The third child of Thomas Clancy and Emily Peake was Annie Edith Clancy, who was born on the 24th of July 1890 in Queensland. She married George Perkins Taylor in Victoria in 1918. They had 5 children, and Annie died at Gardenvale, Victoria on the 12th of August 1966. The fourth child, Thomas Richard Clancy, was born at Monal, Queensland on the 5th of January 1893. He married Winifred Kathleen McIntyre in 1915 in Victoria. Thomas enlisted in World War I. On the 5th of August 1915, he listed his occupation as a clerk, and he fought in France. He was discharged on the 20th of October 1919. They had 2 daughters in 1920 and 1921, and Thomas died at Greensborough, Victoria on the 11th of June 1947, aged 54. And just a little on Thomas Gerald Clancy's siblings. Well, John Joseph Clancy was the oldest in the family. He was born in Cork, Ireland in 1831. John married Thomasina Mary D'Aulnay at Strathfield Say, Victoria on the 23rd of June 1854. Sometime during 1856, John Clancy moved from Strathfield Say to Back Creek, where he was employed as a butcher. Back Creek between Bendigo and Sheepwash flowed into Bendigo Creek, about where Lake Waroona now is. John and Thomasina were amongst their own kin, for there was a large Irish population in the area. Thomasina gave birth to a baby girl on the 25th of November, 1856. She was baptised Mary on the 7th of December, with William Roger D'Aulnay and Mary Nano Doran being sponsors. Thomasina died on the 17th of February of puerperal fever, which was an ever-present risk in births in the 19th century, and she was buried at the Junction Cemetery the following day, Dr. Backhurst performing the last rites. Shortly afterwards, the baby also died, and this was the first occasion of bereavement experienced by the Clancy family in Victoria. The next reference to John Clancy was in the electoral roll for 1856, where he was listed as a hotel keeper on Melbourne Road, which would be somewhere between Viewpoint and Golden Square. The next event in the story of the Clancys was the remarriage of John. In 1855, there came from Scotland a widowed lady called Janet Rankin and her 7 children. Janet kept a boarding house at Littleton Terrace, and John was a boarder there after he was widowed. He met Janet's daughter, Eliza Rankin, there. In 1858, the Rankins were on a farm at Kyneton, so it was in St Mary's Church, Kyneton, that John Clancy and Eliza were married on the 3rd of June 1858. John was listed as a butcher, aged 27, and Eliza 24. The witnesses were Thomas Gerald Clancy and Catherine Angela Clancy. They had 9 children. On the 31st of January 1860, it was recorded that John Joseph Clancy of Ironbark Gully near Sandhurst, publican, causes of insolvency from the fact of the whole ground adjacent to his place of business being taken up under the new leasing regulations and being allowed to remain unworked, consequent depopulation of his neighbourhood, pressure of creditors, ill health and fear of imprisonment. He had liabilities of £433 and his assets were £549, leaving a surplus of £115. And a month later, in the insolvent estate of John Joseph Clancy, the sale of the Ironbark Hotel. So by September 1860, John's listed as a minor and residing at Inglewood, and they lived there until around 1868, and then they moved to Linscombe Pools, which is near Cowra in New South Wales. They then lived in Deniliquin in 1871, Parkes from 1874 to 1876, Booligal in 1881 to 1884, and Carnargo in 1884. John Clancy was listed as working as a drover in Hay in 1891, and John died on the 11th of October 1897 in Wilcannia, New South Wales, aged 66. And it says the many friends of Mr. John Clancy will regret to hear of his death, which occurred in hospital on Monday evening. He'd been ailing for some time, having come in from White Cliffs for medical attendance. Mr. Clancy was greatly respected and well known by a number of old settlers of the district, having been engaged in droving for many years past. For some time he lived at Booligal, where his family subsequently resided for many years. So overall, John Clancy, known as Jack, was a butcher, a hotel keeper, a sheep station manager, an overseer, a drover, a teacher, a shearer, a pound keeper, an opal miner, a cook, and he was also a drover on Overflow Station. So there is a theory out there that it in fact was John Clancy that was the inspiration of Clancy of the Overflow, because apparently he was firm friends with Banjo as they had met at the diggings. Banjo used to visit Yulonga at Booligal, and another theory is that that's where John got to know him. The second child, Eleanor, was born in Cork Island on the 25th of March 1832. She married Robert Stewart, a wool classer, on the 20th of January 1851 in Geelong. They had 4 children born in Glenorchy, Victoria, Carnargo, New South Wales, Bendigo and Snake Gully in Victoria. Eleanor died on the 17th of February 1907 at Glenorchy, aged 74. Catherine Angela was born in Ireland on the 25th of April 1837. She married William Roger Diornay in Bendigo on the 26th of May 1866. Their first child was born at Mathara in 1866 and they had 6 children. From 1868 they were the postmasters and ran the store at Carnargo in New South Wales. William died in 1878, aged only 44. Catherine died in 1884, aged 47. Their youngest child was 8 and their oldest 18 when they lost both their parents. And as mentioned earlier, they are buried in the same grave plot as Catherine's mother Mary in the Deniliquin Cemetery. Child number 4 was Mary Nano Clancy, who was born in Ireland on the 5th of December 1838. Mary met Joseph Doran when she was just 15. Joseph had been raised in County Kerry in Ireland and had been sent to Rome to be educated for the priesthood. After some time, he decided this was not his vocation and returned home. His parents, disappointed and embarrassed by his decision, decided to send him to the colonies. The ship docked at Melbourne and he thought it would be a good idea to try his luck in Bendigo. One morning at Mass, not long after his marriage to Mary, the first priest of Bendigo, Dr. Backhouse, worried by the illiteracy of local children, asked if anyone in the congregation could teach them to read and write. Joseph applied for the position and was appointed as a teacher of the first school in Bendigo. Dr. Backhouse wrote to the denominational school board on the 5th of August 1854, providing this report about his school. It is on the banks of the Bendigo, a quarter of a mile below camp. There are nearly 500 children here, of whom 300 are Catholics. By permission, the school is held in the chapel tent, the furniture consisting of a few boards laid on empty boxes to sit upon. The school has been in existence since the 23rd of May. Mr. Doran has been the teacher since the 27th of June. He is competent and efficient. He had previously taught in Ireland since 1846. It was conducted in a tent, and Joseph and Mary lived in another tent behind the school. Some of the pupils were older than Mary. This embarrassed her, so she used to climb out through the tent window rather than go out through the school. One day Dr. Barkhar saw her and told her a married woman didn't behave like that. In January 1855, the Reverend A.E. Owens reported that a girls' school separated by a petition from the boys' section flourished, and Mary Doran became the teacher there from January to March 1855. So Joseph ceased teaching at the Catholic school in October 1855 after about 16 months' service, but it appears he didn't commence teaching at the National School in Bendigo straight away. In the 1859 directory, he was actually listed as a general produce merchant and residing at Littleton Terrace. However, on the 31st of October 1864, Joseph Cooper Doran is mentioned as an insolvent. Produce merchant of Sandhurst, cause of insolvency, pressure of creditors who refused to accede to the deed of assignment offered by the creditors in September, and fear of arrest. Debts £44, assets £5, deficiency £39. So then after that insolvency, he became a teacher at the National School, and it stated in 1868 that they were living at Littleton Terrace in a 2-storey house. On the 10th and 11th of July 1865, he sat for an examination for the first division of competency as a common schools candidate. His report is not a particularly good one. He failed some subjects and passed in others. Joseph and Mary Doran had a large family of 13, although 4 of the first 7 children died very young, 10 of them born in Bendigo. Joseph Doran taught in Bendigo until 1873, and then he moved north to Runnymede. A supplement in the Government Gazette, dated on the 1st of January 1875, relates to teachers in the department at that date. It states he was appointed to the teaching service on the 1st of July 1853, and the Gazette then records that he was out of service for 18 years, 4 months and 20 days. This suggests that he began teaching almost immediately after he came to Bendigo, that he left teaching in a national school to teach in the school started by Dr. Backhouse, and that he did not resume teaching in a national school until the year 1872. At Runnymede, he was the head teacher of the Bond State School in February 1874. Conditions were primitive at the school. It was a dilapidated leased building with no chimney or floor and no glass in the windows. It failed to hold teachers or properly serve the district, and it appeared to have closed for a time until it reopened with Doran as head teacher. He found it bare of equipment or furniture, and water had to be carried from the Campaspe River half a mile away. In 1879, the Bond State School closed. Its pupils were then accommodated at a newly built state school at Bond, with Mr. Doran as head teacher. The school he taught in for 5 years had an enrolment that rose as high as 40, with an average attendance of 26. Schooling at that time was not compulsory, so some older pupils attended only when not working on farms. Joseph Doran worried about this, and in order to meet the needs of these children, he sought from the Education Department permission to conduct night classes. This was granted, but the department said his wages would remain the same. These older children, some being young men with beards, came for an hour's schooling and then finished the night with a dance outside the school to the music of a concertina. Needless to say, this night school became very popular. This was a wooden schoolhouse with teachers' quarters of 2 rooms. Obviously, this was not going to provide adequate accommodation for the Doran family, and it seems the Dorans obtained a more adequate house in Runnymede. His salary was insufficient to feed a large family, so he and Mary took steps to supplement that income. He caught fish in the river and had a large vegetable garden. Mary boarded 2 boys and took in dressmaking. In this, she was helped by their eldest daughter, Frances, who'd left school. The old Runnymede township, which there is nothing practically left there now, was about 12 miles from Rochester, and Bond was halfway between them. Runnymede died rapidly once the railway went through Rochester. Joseph Doran left Bond to open a new school at Watcham West on the 11th of November 1882. Watcham West is near Donald in the northern Wimmera. This was a wooden portable school that had an attached quarters of 2 rooms. By now, some of the older children in the family were no longer living with them, so it reduced pressure on accommodation a little. The average attendance at this school was 14 to 17 students in 1886, but this fell away, so that between April 1888 and August 1889, the school was worked part-time. Joseph retired from teaching in November 1890, and he acquired a property at Wachupka near Woomalang. Until a house was built on the farm, he leased a nearby inn called Cavian and ran it. Joseph named his property Windy Heights. He died there on the 11th of January 1898, aged 71. Mary Doran continued to live at Windy Heights until her death on the 4th of April 1921 at the advanced age of 84 years. By this time, the only Clancys of that generation still alive were Richard and Geraldine, the two born in Australia. Both Joseph and Mary Doran are buried at Birchip, and the property Windy Heights has remained in the Doran family. The deep religious faith of Joseph and Mary does burn brightly in their descendants, and several have given themselves full-time service of their church. The fifth child, Agnes Ann Clancy, was born in April 1841 in Ireland. She married John Condon in 1865 in Balranald, and Mary died at Wanganella, New South Wales on the 28th of March 1867 when she was only 26. So Agnes's husband, John Condon, was also a drover, and in the Pastoral Times Deniliquin newspaper on the 27th of November 1815, it announced his death. It says, a drover's death, accidentally drowned. John Condon, a drover well known throughout the district, was drowned at Walcool Creek on Saturday afternoon. Constable Brown stated that he went to North Walcool to make inquiries about Condon, who was missing. He then went there with Tracker Murphy on Monday. The following morning, they went to the North Walcool Bridge over the creek about 36 miles from Deniliquin and searched for tracks along the creek. They found horse tracks on the banks about half a mile above the bridge. There were 8 or 9 places where a horse had got to the edge of the stream but had not gone in. There were plenty of sheep tracks. About 40 yards across the creek there was a large island. He searched the island and saw where 2 sheep had come out of the water. They dragged the creek where the horse had gone in, and on Wednesday morning they found the body of the man. The hands were bent slightly inwards and one hand clasped a whip. He opened the clothing and made a rough examination. There was a small flesh wound on the top of the head that could have been done by the grappling iron. The body was clothed. The body was very little discoloured. The skin was just commencing to come off the face. The body was found in 10 foot of water, about 20 yards below the marks on the bank and 30 yards from the edge. He removed the body to the deceased's residence in Wick Street. Patrick Condon, drover, said the deceased was his brother and lived in Deniliquin with his wife and children. On the 17th of November, he and his brother left from Deniliquin for Brassai, where they took delivery of 2,000 sheep. The witness drove in a light spring cart and his brother rode. They were taking the sheep to Pine Lodge near Moolameen and had to cross the Walcool Bridge. When about 2.5 miles from the bridge, the witness left his brother with the sheep at the boundary gate. The deceased was leading his horse then and putting the sheep through the gate. He had the 2 dogs with him. The witness drove to the bridge to fix the camp for the night. He waited till after sundown and then went back to see why the deceased did not arrive with the sheep. He saw the sheep were on the reserve where he saw them previously. He did not see the dogs and could not see any sign of his brother. He went back to the camp thinking his brother might have gone there a different way. Half an hour later, the witness went back and found the sheep along the fence and the 2 dogs guarding them. He continued the search all night. On daylight on Sunday, he found the horse near the creek with the saddle on but no bridle. He afterwards found the bridle hanging on a small sapling. It could have been rubbed off by the horse. About midday, he saw the manager of the North Walcool and told him his brother was missing, and he afterwards saw the boundary rider named Potter. He and Potter searched and saw some horse tracks on the bank of the creek, and then got Potter to ring up Mackenzie & Co. and report that his brother was missing. He was present on Wednesday when his brother's body was found by the police. The deceased was in good health and spirits when he saw him on Saturday. He did not have any troubles. He was very temperate. In the witness's opinion, the sheep must have rushed to the water and the deceased evidently went to the creek to turn them back. Some of the sheep must have got into the water and across to the island, and the deceased may have attempted to cross the creek and bring them back. The deceased could not swim. To the coroner, the police found the padding in the saddle was wet. The deceased's property comprised of a house and a half acre of land, 2 horses, a gig, a harness, spring cart and harness, and a life policy for £150. He was 40 years of age, married and had 3 children, and a verdict of accidentally drowned was recorded. And just as an aside, Tracker Murphy, who was mentioned in this article, I have an episode on Tracker Murphy. So if you're interested in finding more about Deniliquin's Black Tracker, it was episode 13. The sixth child, Richard Patrick, was born in Melbourne on the 16th of October 1842. Richard was a storekeeper in Bulllegal, New South Wales in 1884. He received news that he was an executor, along with Patrick Connolly of Limerick, to the will of his aunt, Mary Teresa Clancy of Bridgetown Island. Mary had died on the 8th of December 1883 and was a widow of Richard's uncle, John Clancy. Richard was under an obligation to travel to Ireland, which he did in 1885. And while in Ireland, Richard met Mary Connolly, and the courtship was very brief. He married on the 30th of September 1885 at Rathgar. Richard and Mary returned to Melbourne on the Iberia in April 1886. Richard was 40 and Mary was 38 at the time, and they settled in St Kilda. Their first child, Richard Jr., was born on the 4th of September 1886, and their second child, John Henry, was born on the 13th of May 1888. After their second child was born, they moved to the Gladstone goldfields in Queensland, where Richard and his brother Thomas began gold mining. They were initially owners of a battery that crushed ore for a number of miners, and as an area ceased to be profitable, they moved on, and so the battery moved on too. Richard appeared to have continued with the crushing plant side of mining, either with Thomas or in partnership with other men. In 1892, they were recorded living at Monal, Queensland, and by 1913, Richard was a storekeeper at Mount Morgan, and in 1919, he was a publican at Mount Morgan. Richard and Mary had 4 children all up, and he died on the 8th of December 1922 and is buried at Nudgee Cemetery in Queensland. The seventh child was Geraldine. She was born in Collingwood, Victoria on the 13th of May 1844. She married George James Johnston at Hill Plain on the 31st of July 1869, which was part of the Mathara station just outside of Deniliquin. And in June 1869, it mentions that George James Johnston was insolvent and he was of Mathara station near Deniliquin, the superintendent of the station. They had 6 children. Amy and William were born at Mathara station in 1870 and 1872. Richard was born at Berrimeagle Station in 1876. Catherine and Hubert were born at Wanganella in 1878 and 1881. George was born in Deniliquin in 1884, and the youngest, Thomas, was born at Ready Flat near Adelong in 1887. In 1883, it records George James Johnston of Wanganella applied through Mr McNamara for a hawker's licence, and it was granted. And on the 21st of October 1884, it mentions a will, and it says, "In the will of Catherine Angela Dornay, late of Carnago, notice is hereby given that the probate of the last will and testament of the above-named deceased, who died on the 26th day of August, may be granted to George James Johnston of Wanganella, storekeeper, one of the executors of the will, and being reserved to Richard Patrick Clancy, the other executor." So Banjo Paterson used to visit Geraldine whenever he passed through Adelong, and George died in 1919. There was an article in the Adelong and Tumut Express and Tumbarumba Post at the occasion of George's death. Mr George James Johnston, whose demise was reported in the last issue, having taken place at his home at Deep Creek, Gadara, on the 19th of February at the advanced age of 87 years, was born in Tasmania and left there for Victoria at 15 years. When he grew into manhood, he went into the goldfields, then engaged in teamstering, later embarking in storekeeping. He came to New South Wales some 50 years ago. In the early 80s, he selected 92 acres of land at Middle Adelong and then later 375 acres. The property had a frontage of Adelong Creek. This, with the assistance of his family, he largely improved. He sold out of his Middle Adelong property and came to live at Gadara. Pastoral pursuits had the greatest attraction for him, and he was considered a good judge of stock, horses in particular, and conducted the business of working the land with mathematical precision. He was a good friend and neighbour, and one possessed of sound liberal ideas. Those who survive him are a widow and 5 sons and 2 daughters. 2 of their sons, Lieutenant Johnston and Dr R. Johnston, are on active service. And on the 4th of July 1927, Geraldine dies at Adelong at their residence, The Meadows, and she was 81 years old. So there's certainly many descendants of the Clancy family, and there does seem to be evidence that Thomas Clancy was directly or indirectly linked to the Clancy of the Overflow poem, but there's also another theory saying that his brother Jack could have been the inspiration. In part 2, I'm going to be discussing Thomas Michael McNamara and the evidence that his descendants feel is there that links him directly to the poem.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.